Hey everyone, this is Chapter 9 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Chapter 9 is titled Development Since 1931. Section 1. Consequences of the Decree of the Central Committee of the 25th of January 1931. The beginning of 1931, with its double condemnation by the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party of mechanism and Dialecticism alike, represents a decisive turning point in the history of Soviet philosophy. Whereas previously there had at least been a continuing opposition between rival tendencies within Soviet philosophy, and a resultant conflict of schools and opinions with discussion and controversy, all such contention is from this time forward abolished. The course of philosophy flows in the narrow channel of officially prescribed opinion. All controversy is now directed outwards, merely against the quote, bourgeois ideology, which is striven against as a class enemy. To be sure, quote, discussions are still conducted within Soviet philosophy itself, but these are no longer concerned to promote the emergence of truth from an interchange of conflicting opinions, being devoted merely to discovering and, quote, rooting out deviations on the part of individual authors from the course laid down by the, quote, classics of Marxism, end quote. Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. For Deborin himself, the immediate consequence of the judgment on the 25th of January 1931 was that he was compelled to resign his post as chief editor of the journal titled Under the Banner of Marxism. The paper was entrusted to an editorial board composed of supporters of the, quote, party line and distinguished for its party loyalty. The members of this board included Pokrovsky, Adoratsky, Mitten, Yudin, and Maximov. But in spite of this, Deborin, who, as we have seen, made open acknowledgement of his, quote, error and freely showed his remorse, continued to occupy leading positions on the, quote, philosophical front. Thus we later find him on the council of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences, or the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences, and even, as deputy chairman, on the editorial board of the Vestnik of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. The leading philosopher of the 30s, who repeatedly occupies a prominent position, especially in the first half of the decade, is undoubtedly Mark Borisovich Mitten. On specifically philosophical questions, the new movement sponsored by him remains faithful to the dialectical materialism already preached by Deborin himself against the mechanists. Thus, one of its main concerns, for example, is to uphold against mechanism the independent status of philosophy. It is also anxious to assert and establish, on philosophical grounds, the impossibility of reducing phenomena of higher order to those of a lower order, e.g. of life to physico-mechanical laws, and does so by giving prominence to the category of quality. This too is a major feature of Deborin's dialectical materialism. The main respects in which the new movement is distinguished from that of Deborin are questions rather of method and form. Whereas it had been raised as an objection against Deborin during the period of struggle that his philosophical labors were too much divorced from concrete life, that he trespassed against the Marxist postulate of the unity of theory and practice, the attempt was now accordingly made to conform to this postulate by endeavoring after the greatest possible integration of philosophy with concrete life. One of the means to this end being the demand that nobody should be a philosopher who did not also cultivate one of the positive sciences. Having been a further and major complaint against Deborin that he neglected the need for, quote, partisanship in philosophy, every effort was now devoted to keeping the work of philosophy in the closest possible contact with the life and work of the party, and to providing the latter with philosophical support in its political struggle for the, quote, party line. This undoubtedly has a bearing on yet another main feature of the new trend in philosophy, namely its emphasis on the outstanding philosophical eminence accorded not to Marx, Engels, or Lenin only, but also to Stalin. Indeed, on looking through the philosophical works published during these years, one gets the impression that in the modern period of Soviet philosophy, there is really only one productive philosopher, only one man capable of creative advance in the subject, namely Stalin. While the philosophical task of all the many professors and authors in the field consists merely in this, that they should expound what Stalin has spoken, not Mitten alone, but all the other authors in question, seize every opportunity of setting in its proper light the whole unique and outstanding contribution of Stalin to the further development of Marxist philosophy. At the very beginning of this period, Mitten had written, quote, "The further advancement of Marxist-Leninist theory in every department, including that of the philosophy of Marxism, is associated with the name of Comrade Stalin. In all Comrade Stalin's practical achievements, and in all his writings, there is set forth the whole experience of the worldwide struggle of the proletariat, the whole rich storehouse of Marxist-Leninist theory," end quote. Mitten, M.B. Mitten. This style of philosophical utterance grew steadily more typical as time went on. The early years of the new regime in philosophy were relatively abundant in the production of philosophical work. From this period there date a considerable number of publications, including both comprehensive treatises, such, for example, as the 2-volume textbook of Mitten and Ruzimovsky on dialectical and historical materialism, and also monographs on individual problems in Marxist-Leninist philosophy, among which particular mention should perhaps be made of P. Dosev's book, The Copy Theory, Studies in the Epistemology of Dialectical Materialism, described by Jakovenko as, quote, "the most solid and fundamental philosophical product," end quote, of this period in Soviet philosophy. In 1936, in the journal Under the Banner of Marxism, Mitten made a survey of the philosophical work done since the, quote, "purge" of 1931. Certainly no period in Soviet philosophy can have been so fruitful in philosophical literature as the years 1931 to 36. In addition to literary activity, there has also been the pedagogic achievement of building up new Bolshevik-trained cadres who have had to be reared up to the level of modern science and of the requirements laid down by the party. This is attested by the list of contributors to the journal titled Under the Banner of Marxism, who have received their training in the Institute of Red Professors. All these achievements, however, could not prevent a threatening storm gathering over Mitten's head also, such that even this very article takes on more the appearance of an apology than of a calm assessment. This may well have been connected with the politico-social upheaval marked by the adoption of the new Constitution in November 1936. The, quote, "Constitution embodying the victory of socialism and workers' and peasants' democracy," end quote. From this time on, there was much talk of democracy, parliamentary institutions, and the liberation of human personality. The example of the Soviet Union in introducing true Soviet parliamentarism was said to have revealed to the eyes of the world's workers that the only road to true socialism and true democracy was the dictatorship of the proletariat, the road, that is, of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. Leninist-Stalinist socialism alone redeems human personality. The true humanism of Marxist-Leninism finds its expression in love for oppressed humanity, and the relentless prosecution of the class struggle for the classless society is the indispensable condition for the victory of proletarian humanism throughout the entire world. This new spirit may well have also had its repercussions in the fields of culture and philosophy. At all events, the fact is that even the latest phase of Soviet philosophy, Mitten et al., now suddenly began to be described as, quote, "out of date" and senile and subjected to vehement abuse. Despite the loud assurances of Mitten and company that Marxist-Leninist philosophy represented the summit of all philosophical thought, that Lenin had inaugurated a new epoch in philosophy, that the presence of Stalin guaranteed the further development of philosophy along the right path, despite the emphasis on partisanship in philosophy and the indissoluble unity of theory and practice, it was charged against them that their writings of the years 1932 to 34 were in every respect outdated and completely useless, owing to their, quote, "abstract and scholastic presentation of the subject," end quote. The complaint was raised that their books were polluted, quote, "with questions from the execrable writings of Trotsky and Zinoviev," end quote, and were full of, quote, "crass political illiteracies," end quote. It throws a revealing light on the atmosphere in which philosophical life is carried on in the Soviet Union, that Mitten hastened to acknowledge that his latest writings had transgressed against the line laid down by the party for the, quote, "philosophical front." This may be the reason why, despite the attacks launched against him, Mitten has remained to this day one of the leading philosophers and theoreticians in the Soviet Union. In later years, we find him as deputy director of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences, at whose General Assembly on the 28th to the 29th of January 1939 he was elected to ordinary membership. Nor again did the attacks on the work of Mitten and his collaborators imply that any fundamental change had taken place in the philosophical teachings of Bolshevism. If we compare the later publications with those of the years 1931 to 36, we find no difference in the doctrines contended for. There's a footnote here that I missed. On the occasion of his nomination to ordinary membership of the Academy of Sciences, Mitten's services to Soviet philosophy were appraised by the Vestnik of the Academy as follows. Mitten is, quote, one of the foremost researchers in the field of philosophy. For the past 10 years, he has been engaged in investigating the problem of dialectical materialism and of the history of philosophy. Among the deepest inquiries devoted to the problems of dialectical materialism are works such as his Burning Questions of Materialist Dialectics, Engels in Dialectical Materialism, Materialist Dialectic, the Philosophy of the Proletariat, Stalin in the Materialist Dialectic. As regards the history of philosophy, particular importance attaches to those works of Mitten which outline the interrelation of ideas between Marxism and classical German philosophy, more especially the philosophy of Hegel, in the book Hegel and Materialist Dialectics, the book Hegel's History of Philosophy, and the book Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Translations of a number of Hegel's greatest works are appearing under M.B. Mitten's editorship, Science of Logic, History of Philosophy. In combination with his scholarly activities, Mitten pursues a thoroughgoing campaign against mechanist and idealist theories in the field of philosophy. In addition to his academic work, Mitten displays great activity as a lecturer and publicist. He is in charge of the Philosophical and Socio-Political Journal under the banner of Marxism and is at present director of the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute. Footnote. This is relation to, or end footnote, and there's another footnote. This is relation to the line. If we compare the later publications with those of the years 1931 to 36, we find no difference in the doctrines contended for. Footnote. This is also the reason why the publications of 1931 to 36 still retain their importance at the present day. End footnote. The differences are chiefly concerned with the formal aspect, ordering of the subject matter, alignment of philosophy to the political activities of the party, which is mainly evinced in the choice of illustrative material, insistence on the partisan character of philosophy, emphasis on the significance of Stalin to philosophy, and the like. In a word, an accentuation of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, even in the sphere of philosophy. In addition, one may also note in the years immediately following a lessening in the actual number of philosophical publications. Losky's opinion dating from 1939 that, quote, in the last 6 years there has been a striking decline of philosophical literature in the USSR, end quote, is particularly true of the years after 1936, at least as so far as quantity is concerned. A quite special importance for all subsequent work in the ideological field attaches to the history of the CPSU Bolshevik Party short course, which appeared in 1938. Although described as, quote, edited by the Commission of the Central Committee of the CPSU Bolsheviks, it was generally attributed, especially after 1948, to the personal authorship of Stalin. Footnote. The official Russian and English editions already frequently cited contain on the title page the legend, edited by a commission of the Central Committee of the CPSU Bolsheviks. Only the Italian translation from 1944 is more explicit in this respect, mentioning Stalin, Kalinin, Molotov, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, Mikoyan, Zhdanov, and Beria as authors, and adding in a special note, quote, sotto la redazione di Stalin. The practical work of editing was not in fact done by any of the Soviet politicians above mentioned, but by the party historian E.M. Yaroslavsky, as may be gathered from an article by the Soviet woman historian A.M. Pankratova in the book 25 Years of Soviet Historical Science in a collective work published by V.P. Volgin, E.V. Tarla, and A.M. Pankratova. The book's titled 25 Years of Historical Sciences in the USSR. And footnote. 1936 saw the introduction of the quote, 1936 saw the introduction of the new, quote, Stalin constitution in the Soviet Union, whereby the socialization of the country was held to be completed. The next step to be taken was the transition to communism, and hence the creation of the preliminary conditions for this transition became a question of urgency in every quarter, notably in matters of economics, politics, and administration. In the economic fields, the prerequisite for communism was held to be an abundant surplus of material goods. In the political field, quote, the communist education of the workers, end quote, together with, quote, abolition of the survivals of capitalism in the consciousness of the people, end quote, and, quote, further reinforcement of the power of the Soviet state, end quote. In the administrative field, the crucial task was seen in the creation of cadres, the problem of effecting a, quote, scientific organization of effort towards the propagation and training of cadres for party and state, end quote. For their ideological equipment, it was said, Stalin and the party had now sought, by this book, Short History, to put into the hands of the cadres awaiting formation, a book which should present them with a history not only of, quote, great deeds, but also of, quote, great ideas. The history of the party was meant to be depicted in this handbook as an unfolding of the fundamental ideas of Marxism-Leninism as, quote, Marxist-Leninism in action, end quote. Having received the approval of the party central committee, the Kratky Kurs thereupon became an officially prescribed work, or as Zhdanov expressed it, a, quote, encyclopedia of basic knowledge in the field of Marxist-Leninism, a guide laying down the official interpretation of basic problems in the history of the CPSU Bolsheviks and of Marxist-Leninism as verified by the party central committee and in no way allowing of arbitrary interpretation, end quote. Zhdanov. Throughout all the years that followed until Stalin's death, this book was now destined to exercise an absolute dictatorship in the ideological sphere. New section. The Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences. A further development of philosophy in the Soviet Union is intimately connected with the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. This institute has been part of the Academy of Sciences only since 1936. In February 1936, in fact, by decree of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party and the Council of People's Commissars, the Communist Academy, founded in June 1918, was incorporated into the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. This meant that the Philosophical Institute, which had existed since 1928, within the Communist Academy, was also transferred to the Academy of Sciences. On this occasion, it was considerably enlarged and placed under the direction of V.V. Adoratsky, M.B. Mitten, who at that time was not even a member of the Academy, being nominated as its deputy. In 1939, the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences selected P.F. Yudin, who was merely a corresponding member, as director of the Institute. On the council we find, among others, names already known to us, or such as we shall meet again in what follows: A.M. Deborin, M.B. Mitten, I.K. Lupol, B.E. Baikhovsky, E.M. Yaroslavsky, A.A. Maximov, F.I. Kaskhatchik, and others. The work done by the Philosophical Institute in the pre-war years was not very extensive. The main task assigned to it were the issue of a 6 to 7 volume history of philosophy, of which the first volume was printed in 1939 and the second in 1940, under the editorship of Mitten, Yudin, Alexandrov, and Baikhovsky, together with the preparation of a 2-volume direct dictionary of philosophy, of which the first volume under the editorship of Mitten, Yudin, Alexandrov, Konstantinov, and Cheremnik appeared in print in 1939. Great importance was attached to the bringing out of a textbook of Dialectical Materialism. As early as 1938, at the council meeting of the Social Science section of the Academy of Sciences, Mitten produced a report titled on the plan for a textbook of dialectical materialism, but this plan, like the history of philosophy, remained a project for years afterwards. As preliminary makeshifts, there appeared in 1939 a second edition of V.M. Posner's book Outline of Dialectical Materialism, and in 1940 A.V. Jeglov's one-volume short outline of the history of philosophy. Besides this, a start was made upon editions in Russian of the works of Western European philosophers such as Bacon, Helvetius, Condillac, Rousseau, and Fortier, and the Russian translation of Hegel was continued. From among the writings of the Russian forebears of Bolshevism, there appeared a volume of selected philosophical essays by N.G. Chernyshevsky, but the output of the original monograph is relatively small. A special and peculiar task still assigned to the Institute was the campaign against religion. In 1938, the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences complained that the Institute was not doing justice to this task. 2 years later, the Presidium again returned to the subject and recommended the Institute to enlist specialists in the natural sciences for the purpose of its anti-religious work and to carry on the campaign in the closest possible association with the League of Militant Atheists. It is an evident proof of the great importance which has continued to be assigned to philosophy in the Soviet Union that not even the major crisis of the Second World War, calling as it did for all efforts to be concentrated on military tasks, was sufficient to extinguish interest in the work of philosophy, either among the philosophical workers themselves or on the part of the party's authorities. In 1944, a decree was issued by the Central Committee of the CPSU Bolsheviks on shortcomings in the scientific work being done in philosophy, which points to serious errors in the exposition and assessments of German philosophy contained in Volume 3 of the History of Philosophy, which had meanwhile appeared. The authors of Volume 3 were held to have sinned by passing over in silence the reactionary attitude of Hegel, his nationalism, and his deification of the Germans as a, quote, chosen people. New section, the, quote, philosophical discussion of 1947 and its aftermath. With the end of the Second World War, philosophical activity in the Soviet Union received a powerful new impulse, an impulse wholly in keeping with that same spirit of partisanship in philosophy, which even before the war had already lent its peculiar cast to Soviet philosophy, and which now redoubled in strength and equipped with certain new features, again makes its presence felt. Among, quote, workers on the philosophical front, and, quote, we still encounter a proportion of the same names as before the war, Deborin, Mitten, Alexandrov, and Baikovsky, but a number of new names also gained importance, Kedrov, Leonov, Iovchuk, and others. One of the leading philosophical personalities at the moment is Georgy Fedorovich Alexandrov, born 1908, sometime director of the Philosophical Institute. When the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences elected Georgy Fedorovich Alexandrov on the 30th of November 1946 to its ordinary membership, the, quote, Vestnik of the Academy of Sciences, unquote, presented Georgy Fedorovich Alexandrov to its readers with the following account of Georgy Fedorovich Alexandrov's services to philosophical scholarship. Quote, Georgy Fedorovich Alexandrov, born 1908, Stalin Prize winner, head of the propaganda and agitation section of the Central Committee of the CPSU Bolsheviks, professor of the history of philosophy in the Academy of Social Sciences. G.F. Alexandrov is widely known in the USSR and also abroad as a gifted exponent of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. The scope of this theoretical interest is extremely broad, ranging from the philosophy of antiquity to that of modern times, from the history of the rise and development of Marxist philosophy to criticism of contemporary philosophy and bourgeois sociology. In each of these fields, G.F. Alexandrov has distinguished himself by a considerable number of original publications, displaying a high level of scientific research and making a new contribution to our philosophical knowledge. We are also indebted to the pen of G.F. Alexandrov for a series of works dealing with history of social theories with together with a number of books, pamphlets, and articles directed against fascism. The most important of his scientific treatises are Aristotle's Conception of the Philosophy of Nature, published in 1936, Aristotle's Conception of Social and Political Theory, a study entitled Aristotle in 1940, and A History of Western European Philosophy, 1946. In 1942, G.F. Alexandrov was awarded the Stalin Prize for his scientific work. For his outstanding achievements, G.F. Alexandrov has been decorated with the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Banner of Labor, the Order of the Patriotic War, First Class, and with the medals, quote, for the defense of Moscow, end quote, and, quote, for heroic service in the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945, end quote. The name of Alexandrov is associated with what is easily the most important philosophical event in the Soviet Union since the end of the war, namely the discussion arranged by the Central Committee of the party in June 1947 on his history of Western European philosophy, this being the occasion of the celebrated intervention on the part of A. Zhdanov, in which he pilloried a number of Alexandrov's failings and deviations from orthodoxy. A discussion on this book had already been taken place in the Philosophical Institute in January 1947, but this having turned out, as Zhdanov put it, a, quote, pale and, quote, ineffective affair. The Central Committee of the CPSU Bolsheviks ordered the organization of a new discussion on a much more extensive scale. If Alexandrov has in fact achieved wide fame abroad as well, he owes this not so much to his works as to the discussion on this book and its official condemnation by the Secretary of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. What had happened? How are we to account for this sudden reversal in the evaluation of Alexandrov's scientific achievements? How did it come about that Alexandrov, who only 6 months previously had received such praise from the Academy of Sciences, the first 1945 edition of whose book had been commended by decree of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union as worthy of the Stalin Prize and received in Bolshevik, the theoretical and political journal of the party's Central Committee, an extremely appreciative notice in which its, quote, high theoretical standard, depth of content, and clarity of presentation, and, quote, were approvingly referred to? How did it come about that this same Alexandrov and this very same book were made the occasion for the Central Committee's incursion upon the philosophical front? The reasons for this procedure are not entirely clear, but if one looks more closely at Zhdanov's intervention in the debate, one gets the impression that the whole of this noisy discussion was dragged in only in order to give the Central Committee the opportunity of delivering an attack on the, quote, philosophical front and of achieving a corresponding emphasis in laying down new norms for philosophical work. This interpretation is confirmed by the relative triviality of the shortcomings censored in Alexandrov's book, by the fact that only a part of Zhdanov's speech is devoted to the book itself, the whole second part of it being given over to an indictment of conditions on the, quote, philosophical front, end quote, in general, and lastly by the consideration that this attack on the, quote, philosophical front represents not one link in the chain of similar incursions into the ideological field on the part of the Central Committee into literature, 1946, into music, 1948, and also into biology. The discussion held in Moscow was attended by more than 90, quote, workers in philosophical science and from Moscow and the Union Republics, including Mitin, Svetlov, Kedrov, Iovchuk, and others. The book itself was criticized for its lack of party spirit, evinced in its objective manner of presentation, its inadequate investigation of the social roots of philosophical systems. There were also loud protests against its manner of dealing separately with Western European philosophy without giving a simultaneous account of the history of Russian philosophy as well. Zhdanov's speech laid particular stress on the fact that in Alexandrov's book, the history of philosophy appears a smooth, continuous process of development. Marxist philosophy does not emerge clearly as a revolutionary eruption into philosophy. Quote, the author obviously does not understand that Marx and Engels created a new philosophy, differing qualitatively from all previous philosophical systems, however progressive they were, end quote. Zhdanov. The revolutionary novelty introduced by Marxism consists in the fact that, quote, that it, quote, supersedes the old philosophy, end quote, which, quote, was the property of a small elite, the aristocracy of the intellect, end quote. And Marx, quote, the beginning of a completely new period in the history of philosophy, when it became a scientific weapon in the hands of the proletarian masses in their struggle for emancipation from capitalism, end quote. Zhdanov. The main weakness of the book, which Zhdanov censors, is its, quote, objectivist spirit. The exposition is abstract, neutral, and Alexandrov sees in every philosopher, first of all, a professional associate, and only secondarily an opponent. Moreover, the author violates the basic position of scientific materialism as regards the dependence of the development of ideas upon the material conditions of social life. This deprives the book of a large part of its scientific character. Zhdanov also sees it as a fundamental failing of the book that it is only carried up to the rise of Marxism, 1848, and more especially that it leaves Russian philosophy completely on one side, which implies a belittlement of Russian philosophy and endorsement of the bourgeois distinction between, quote, Western and, quote, Eastern culture. Zhdanov then goes on in the second part of his speech to deal with the general situation on the, quote, philosophical front, quote, the fact that the book did not evoke any considerable protest, that it required the intervention of the Central Committee, and particularly Comrade Stalin, to express its inadequacies, end quote. This is a proof for Zhdanov that serious misconceptions are abroad on the philosophical front. The philosophical front is no longer a real front. Philosophical work does not manifest either a militant spirit or a Bolshevik tempo. The Philosophical Institute presents a particularly unsatisfactory picture. Only in name does it represent an institution of an all-union character. In reality, it is completely out of touch at the periphery, with the philosophical institutes and chairs in the individual republics, regions, and territories. The work of the Institute is scarcely directed at all to contemporary problems, being still far too much oriented upon the past. Zhdanov sees the reason for these deficiencies in the fact that the workers in philosophy have not yet taken to heart the lessons inculcated by the Central Committee and its injunctions against lack of ideas and an unpolitical character in ideological work, against the divorce of the latter from contemporary issues, against the deification of all things foreign, and in favor of a militant Bolshevik party spirit. The philosophers have supposed that all this is none of their concern. There has also been a lack of true Bolshevik criticism and self-criticism. At this point, Zhdanov makes it a complaint against Alexandrov, personally, that Alexandrov overestimates his own powers and relies on a far too narrow circle of intimate collaborators and admirers. In this way, the work of philosophy has become to some extent the monopoly of a small group of philosophers. All these failings can only be put down to the lack of true Bolshevik criticism and self-criticism. Quote, in summing up at the end of the discussion, Comrade Alexandrov admitted that serious faults and failings have been disclosed both in his book and in the organization of scientific work in the philosophical field. Comrade Alexandrov then went on to discuss how a course in the history of philosophy ought to be arranged if it was to do justice to what had been said in the discussion, and what consequences must be drawn from the debate for the organization of scientific work in the field of philosophy. In an article in the journal Bolshevik devoted to this discussion, these consequences are summarized in the following terms, quote, the substance of the discussion constitutes a serious warning to workers in philosophy that it is their duty to uphold the banner of Leninist-Stalinist partisanship throughout their scientific work. It's interesting. So I feel like I don't really see the word Stalinist being being used by Stalinists. Anyway, continuing on. that it is their duty to uphold the banner of Leninist-Stalinist partisanship throughout their scientific work by theoretical elucidation of the problems of the Soviet system and all-round exposition of its great virtues, by treatment of the problems of Soviet culture and all-round demonstration of its superiority to bourgeois culture, by energetic campaigning against all manifestations of servility towards bourgeois culture, and against any and every residue of capitalism in the mentality of the people. ... It must be the task of the Soviet philosophers to put themselves at the spearhead of the struggle against the decadent and horrible ideology of the bourgeoisie and to deal out devastating blows against it. End quote. Zhdanov. War upon non-party, quote, objectivism, war upon servility towards bourgeois culture, war upon, quote, cosmopolitanism, and cultivation of Soviet Russian patriotism. These are the watchwords that the, quote, philosophical discussion, end quote, was evidently employed to proclaim. In order to draw out the practical consequences of this discussion, Alexandrov delivered a lecture a few months later in the Philosophical Institute on the program of the Institute's scientific work during the next 2 or 3 years. Zhdanov had dwelt on the fact that the philosophers were lagging far behind in their work and were not fulfilling their part in the collective plan for communist education of the workers. Soviet philosophy must not remain the exclusive property of a small parcel of professors. It must be made available to the entire Soviet intelligentsia and must serve the interests of the party. In order to do justice to the great role which Marxist-Leninist philosophy has always played and must continue to play in the party's struggle, the Philosophical Institute must needs organize its scientific work in such a fashion that the lost ground is made up and philosophical backslidings are avoided in the future. A true philosophical front must be created, filled with militant zeal, whose business it must be to further the progress of science, and to deal out devastating blows against ideologies hostile to communism. For this purpose, the Philosophical Institute must establish contact not only with all the other institutes in the Academy of Sciences, but also with all qualified professors of philosophy throughout the entire Soviet Union, and endeavor to provide effective aid to theoretical workers on the periphery. The habit of individual working must cease, and a beginning must be made towards solving the great theoretical problems by combined effort. The lecture ended with the proposal to begin publication of a philosophical library in which the works of the most outstanding philosophers, and especially of Russian authors, would be made available to a wider public. The first visible result of this great self-searching was the philosophical journal Problems of Philosophy, replacing the periodical under the banner of Marxism, which disappeared in 1944. It appears 3 times a year, each number consisting of about 400 double-column pages, and contains systematic articles dealing with individual aspects of Soviet philosophy, dialectical and historical materialism, philosophy of science, history of philosophy in Russia and in the other nations of the Soviet Union, copious polemics against, quote, bourgeois philosophy, reviews of new publications, and a chronicle of Soviet philosophical life. It is issued by the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR and is dedicated to, quote, carrying on an active and unrelenting struggle against the philosophy of bourgeois reaction and bourgeois objectivism in the interest of the basic Leninist thesis of partisan spirit in philosophy and of a militant materialism. ... The watchword of the journal is the wise saying to Stalin: to be a master of Marxist-Leninist theory is to understand it, to develop it, and to carry it further. End quote. The original chief editor was B.M. Kedrov, who was later superseded by D.I. Chesnokov. At its first beginning, Vопроsi Philosophie brought once more a breath of fresh air into Soviet philosophy. Several notable essays appeared, fundamental discussions were initiated, and so on. Particularly worthy of note is an article by M.A. Markov on the nature of physical knowledge, which will occupy us in more detail in Part 2, in which the author is so bold as to say something new, which had never been said before by any of the, quote, classics of Marxist-Leninism, and which actually seeks to explain physics in complete independence from Leninism. This article provoked a lively discussion to which the editors readily gave space. Similar controversies arose out of an article by Z.A. Kamensky titled On the Problem of Tradition in Russian Materialist Philosophy of the 18th and 19th Centuries, from the publication of the draft program for a course on the foundations of Marxist-Leninist aesthetics. It seems, however, that under Kedrov's leadership, the Stalinist motto about furthering the development of Marxist-Leninist theory must have been taken too seriously by the editorial board. Hardly had the fourth number appeared before Kedrov was relieved of his post and the journal reorganized. In the leading article of the first number, put out by the new editorship of the previous incumbents, are charged with having published a series of defective articles. The article by Markov, which Kedrov must have taken under his wing, as appears both from his notes to the discussion and from the, quote, tendentious choice of the contributions published therein, the article Concepts of the Whole in Modern Biology by I. Schmalhausen, which contradicts the principles of Maturinist biology from beginning to end, see below, and the article by Kamensky, which ought not to have been discussed, since it, quote, raised questions which are not open to dispute and sought to revise the positions of Marxist-Leninism in relation to the history of Russian social thought, end quote. New section. Section 4. From the, quote, philosophical discussion, end quote, to the death of Stalin, an even greater sensation and still more lasting consequences were occasioned by a further event on the, quote, theoretical front, which, although directly related to another sector on this front, had repercussions also in the philosophical sphere, and must therefore be briefly mentioned, namely a similar incursion on the part of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party into the territory of biology. Footnote. The, quote, biological discussion was made the subject of propaganda on a particularly large scale and has therefore attracted greater attention abroad as well. But, quote, discussions of very much the same type were also instituted within a number of other scientific and cultural fields. The measures for self-purging and renewal undertaken in literature and music are well known. Those in the field of historical writing and research are less familiar. The latter, as it happens, was originated in the condemnation of a work by the Soviet historian N.L. Rubinstein, are tolerably closely connected with the, quote, philosophical discussion. And footnote. The issue here related to the classical Mendel-Morgan theory of inheritance. This will be remembered, accounts for the fact that the descendants of an organism exhibit the same structure as their ancestors by reference to, quote, genes, which function as the material carriers of the morphological and physiological characteristics. In opposition to this, a new theory of inheritance was set up by a number of Soviet scientists, notably Michurin, and more recently Lysenko. This theory denies the existence of, quote, genes and asserts the heritable transmission of characteristics acquired by the organism during its own lifetime, thereby in principle allowing for the possibility of using artificial regulation of the living conditions of organisms in order to guide the development of nature in accordance with human desires. Now, since this theory, with its denial of fixed unalterable species, was in striking accord with one of the basic principles of dialectical materialism, which rejects all unchangeable entities as, quote, metaphysical, it met with the approbation and active support of the party's Central Committee. In order to break the opposition to this new biological theory and to expose the supporters of the classical theory of inheritance, which prior to its condemnation by the Central Committee was still accepted in Soviet biology, also by a number of scientists, notably by the president of the White Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor A. Zhebrak, the director of the Institute of Developmental Morphology, I. Schmalhausen, and others, an elaborately mounted session of the Lenin Academy of Agronomic Sciences was arranged from the 31st of July to the 7th of August, 1948. The entire session was devoted to discussion of Lysenko's report, The Situation in Biological Science, Once Lysenko had declared, quote, "The Central Committee of the party examined my report and approved it," end quote. The fate of the opposition was sealed. Many erstwhile adherents of the Mendel-Morgan theory went over to Maturianism. In a letter to the editors of Pravda, Professor Zhabrak declared, quote, "So long as two schools of thought in Soviet genetics were recognized by the party, and controversies between them were reckoned to constitute a fruitful discussion of theoretical problems, I have been obstinate in defending my own views, ... But now, having convinced myself that the principles of Maturianism in Soviet genetics have been approved by the Central Committee of the CPSU Bolsheviks, I no longer find it possible for myself, as a party member, to persist in these opinions which have been declared erroneous by the Central Committee of our party." End quote. Pravda, 15th of August, 1948. The session was of absolutely crucial significance, not only in Soviet biology, but also far beyond its frontiers for the situation all along the, quote, "theoretical front," and, quote, "in the Soviet Union." The Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences itself held a session on the 15th of August, 1948, which was attended not only by members of the Institute, but also by other philosophical workers in Moscow and adherents of Maturianism in biology, and in which counsel was taken on the value of what had emerged in the historic session of the Academy of Agronomic Sciences. In his opening speech, Alexandrov, the director of the Institute, underlined the great significance of this session of the Academy of Agronomic Sciences. It has shown how the Central Committee guides the development of Soviet science, supporting everything progressive and cutting away everything reactionary in it. So far as the Philosophical Institute is concerned, Soviet philosophers are indeed for the most part supporters of Maturianist view. Only a few of them, such as P.P. Bondarenko, for example, have taken up an attitude of indecision. The Maturianist school of biology is in full keeping with the spirit of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, whose radical uniqueness lies precisely in its pursuit of revolutionary changes, in reality in the name of the victory of communism. Where the hell am I? 2 years after the, quote, discussion of Alexandrov's book, a collective, quote, heart-searching on the state of philosophical studies was again instituted. From 8th to the 15th of July, 1949, a, quote, all-union conference of holders of chairs of Marxist-Leninism and philosophy and institutions of higher education, and, quote, was gathered together in Moscow from all quarters of the Soviet Union. The focal point of the conference was occupied by the report delivered by S.V. Kaftanov, Minister of Higher Education, quote, on the state of instruction in Marxist-Leninism and philosophy and institutions of higher education and measures for its improvement, end quote. The minister conceded that in consequence of the discussions on problems of biology, the chairs of Marxist-Leninism and philosophy had found themselves obliged to enter into closer collaboration with teaching departments in the special sciences, and that their influence on the ideal conduct of instruction in these departments had thereby sensibly increased. In spite of this, however, Kaftanov also pointed to failings in the work of the chairs of general philosophy. There is still evidence in many quarters of an objectivist attitude, of inadequate adherence to the principle of partisanship, of a lack of penetrating criticism and self-criticism, nor have a number of chairs been entering with sufficient energy into the controversy over Maturianism in biology. Many teachers of philosophy have not been doing enough in the course of their work as militant party propagandists, as is witnessed by the fact that they have not been sufficiently forward in uncovering the reactionary character of the theoretical prevarications of bourgeois philosophers in England, and more especially America, nor have they sufficiently exposed the dependent and servile attitude of these latter, directed as it is to upholding the order of imperialist tyranny. Interesting sidelights on the Soviet practice of philosophy are also thrown by the individual speeches of participants in this conference, which are frequently critical of the work of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences. Particular offense was caused by the fact that Alexandrov could not find time to take part. Short resumes of individual contributions to the discussion have been published in Voprosi Philosophy. In the unanimously adopted address to, quote, our leaders and teachers, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the participants in this conference promised, among other things, quote, we shall let ourselves be infallibly guided by our directions as to the strict preservation of the unity of theory and practice, philosophy and politics, as to the principle of Bolshevik partisanship in theory. ... We promise you, dear comrade Stalin, to take a leading part in the struggle against idealist reactionary doctrines. ... We promise you to transform our chairs into militant party collectives, exercising a continuing influence on the entire process of pedagogic teaching and displaying Bolshevik vigilance and tolerance against every manifestation of bourgeois objectivism and cosmopolitanism. We shall fight unceasingly and untiringly against the reactionary ideology of Anglo-American imperialism. By wielding the sharp sword of Bolshevik criticism and self-criticism, we shall raise our work of teaching, scientific research, and party propaganda to a higher level, consonant with the task of the struggle for communism. End quote. Pravda, too, in its issue of the 7th of September 1949, again turned its attention to the philosophical front. In review of the third number of Voprosi Philosophy for 1948, the first to appear under the new editorship, the organ of the Communist Party's Central Committee concedes that under the new board, a gratifying improvement has certainly occurred. For all of that, attention is again drawn to a number of deficiencies, notably the fact that the leading article of the number in question, quote, fails to provide any deep analysis of the situation on the philosophical front in the period that has elapsed since the philosophical discussion. Quote. The new editors thereupon hastened to repair the omission in their next issue. They open in self-critical fashion with the admission, quote, the editors of the journal Voprosi Philosophy acknowledge the observation made in Pravda to be completely justified and accept them as a guide to which they will unfailingly adhere. End quote. They then go on to deal with the situation on the philosophical front. There has certainly been something of a revival during the last 2 years. But in spite of this, the lag on the philosophical sector of the ideological front has not yet been disposed of. Now, as before, the further development of philosophical thought is being carried on outside the precincts of professional philosophy. Many publications still contain errors of an objectivist, nationalist, cosmopolitan, and idealist character. All these shortcomings are particularly evident in the work of the Philosophical Institute. The plan of scientific research for the year 1948 has not been fulfilled. Work on the production of important current monographs is only progressing slowly. Alexandrov has still not contrived to free himself from his, quote, academic, bloodless style of exposition. The Institute is also failing in its task of coordinating the work carried on in the outlying institutes, the Philosophical Institutes of the Ukraine, White Russia, Georgia. Philosophical Institutes of the Ukraine, White Russia, Georgia. For some reason I reread that line. The Philosophical Institutes of the Ukraine, White Russia, Georgia, ... confine themselves exclusively to the history of philosophy in their respective countries and are content to leave the working out of contemporary problems of Marxist philosophy as a, quote, monopoly of the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. All these criticisms oblige the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences to dedicate a session held on the 19th of January 1950 to consideration of the, quote, scientific activities, the present state of affairs, and the training of cadres in the Philosophical Literature Institute. The Presidium drew particular attention to the fact that the Institute had failed to fulfill its plan either in 1948 or 1949, and to the excessive disproportion obtaining between the number of tasks assigned to the Institute by the Academy, 13 projects, and the program devised by the Institute itself, 62 topics. The works published continued to exhibit ideological errors and frequently suffer from a, quote, academic mode of presentation. There is too little recourse to criticism and self-criticism, and concern for the training of cadres does not form a central preoccupation of those in charge. The Presidium called on the director of the Institute, Alexandrov, to see that these deficiencies were remedied, failing which the question of the headship of the Institute would put upon the agenda. As regards the further activities in the Institute, the Presidium laid it down, among other things, that works ready for the press must be subjected to thoroughgoing discussion before publication, and the results of this discussion made public through the medium of the learned journals. After this series of weighty criticisms on the part of the, quote, all-union conference, Pravda, Vопроsi, Philosophy, and now finally the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences, something had at last got to be done within the Institute itself. The Council of the Institute, together with the, quote, entire collective of its staff, end quote, therefore assembled to review the situation in the light of the directive issued by the Presidium on the 19th of January 1950. The committee subjected the work of the Institute as a whole and of its individual sectors and collaborators, but more especially that of the directors, to a searching inquiry. The Vestnik of the Academy of Sciences contains a detailed account of the resolution adopted at the session, which provide us with such a vivid picture of philosophical work in the Soviet Union that at this point we shall quote its report verbatim. Quote, the Council began by acknowledging the complete justice of the profound and comprehensive criticism of the work of the Institute by the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. Having regard to the criticism made, the Council confirmed the plan put forward by the directors for the scientific work of the Institute during 1950, but instructed all sector leaders in the Institute to lose no time in drawing up individual daily schedules of work for each particular worker in the sector concerned, setting a precise finish date for work on every single chapter or section in the projects under preparation. The directors are called upon to exercise strict control over the work plan of the Institute as a whole, and also over that of each individual worker. Special control is to be kept over works undertaken on themes prescribed by the plan of the Academy. The resolution of the Council then goes on to specify in more detail the method of controlling the fulfillment of the plan. Sector leaders are instructed to keep the progress of scientific works under thorough daily supervision, and to be prompt in submitting their co-workers' progress reports to sessions of the sector. The Council then made it clear that the reason for the low quality of ideal content in books already published was chiefly that these works had not previously been made the subject of Bolshevist criticism, and decided that for the future no single work prepared by the Institute should be permitted to appear without having first been subjected to discussion within a wide circle of the scientific public. Quote, continuing, it's still the same thing. Discussions were envisaged in the first instance on the already completed chapters of the collective history of philosophy, namely those on the history of Russian philosophy and that of the peoples of the USSR, the foundation and development of historical and dialectical materialism by Marx and Engels, the further extension of Marxist philosophy by Lenin and Stalin, and more especially the chapters devoted to setting forth the history of Marxist-Leninist philosophy in the Soviet epoch. Similar discussions were projected on works prepared under the auspices of the Academy plan, quote, Lenin and Natural Science, by A. Maximov, corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. The article On the Socialist Soviet State by D.I. Chesnokov, the logical textbooks by A. Chudov, Philosophical Problems of Modern Biology, a collective work, and individual chapters of the collective production titled Studies in the History of Russian Philosophy. It is an elaborately concocted document bringing vividly to life the conditions under which philosophical work is carried on in the Soviet Union, with its atmosphere of planning, control, governmental pressure, and collectivization, in which all free creative endeavor must inevitably be stifled. In all these incursions of the party into the ideological sphere, which have hitherto concerned us, the blow has always been struck by subordinate personalities or party institutions. Zhdanov, the Central Committee. But the summer of 1950 produced yet another. Fuck. There's a missing page. Hold on. Let me get to this. God damn it. Let's see, what page am I on? 206 in the document. Okay, I think I've gotten to. But the summer of 1950 produced yet another intervention in which Stalin, for the first time in 12 years, again found it necessary to take pen in hand on his own account and to lay down the law on matters of ideology. The topic in question here was the seemingly innocent subject of linguistics, and the effect of this intervention was to put a sudden end to the work of Marr and his school, which had hitherto held uncontested sway in the field of Soviet linguistics. Nikolai Yakovlevich Marr, who lived from 1864 to 1934, was the son of a Scottish father and a Georgian mother. After the revolution, he was converted to Marxism and endeavored to establish linguistics on a Marxist basis. In so doing, Marr sets out on the assumption that language must be regarded as a form of, quote, ideology and therefore belongs to the category of the, quote, superstructure. Marr distinguishes in this connection between, quote, simple ideologies, language and thought, and, quote, higher ideologies, religion, art, ethics, law, politics, science, and philosophy. Like all ideologies, language, including grammar, has a class character. Since language, which is intimately bound up with thought, is regarded as an ideology, Marr maintains that its development does not exhibit the characteristics of a gradual evolution, but unfolds by stages, with sharply separated qualitative distinctions between each successive language system, a process reflecting the dialectic of social development. In the concrete, these qualitative leaps are realized in the form of, quote, language crossings, which follow in the train of transformations in the economic basis of society and do not constitute an anomaly, but rather the normal mode of origin of the new types of language. Owing to his conception of language as an ideology, Marr attaches particular importance not only to the form of language, but also to its contents, semantics, or the meaning of words. So far as concerns the interconnection of language and thought, in Marr's account of the matter, present-day spoken language corresponds to the thinking of formal logic, that is, the thought of a society split up into classes. For thousands of years before the rise of articulate speech, there prevailed a system of hand signals or gesture language. Formal logical thinking, with its articulated language, is due in turn to be superseded by dialectical materialist thinking, the mode of thought of the proletariat, of the classless society, whereas under present conditions, articulate language has the upper hand over formal logical thought in the classless society. Quote, thought gains the upper hand over language and will continue to gain it until in the new classless society, not only will the system of spoken language be done away with, but a unitary language will be created, as far and even farther removed from articulate language as the latter is from gesture, end quote. Mar. In this new unified world language, quote, thanks to the latest discoveries, end quote, thought will no longer be in any way dependent on its phonetic expression in language. Thought itself will replace language. Quote, the language of the future is thought, growing out of technique free from the use of natural materials. No language will be able to resist it, certainly not spoken language, forever bound as it is to the norms imposed by nature, end quote. Up till quite recently, Mar's theory of language still ranked as the Soviet linguistics, especially after the discussion on biology, when similar quote battles were staged between true quote materialist doctrines and old quote reactionary tendencies in every branch of science. Mar's linguistics was paraded alongside Michurin's genetics as a true Soviet science. An academician by the name of Meshchaninov even had the idea of drawing a parallel between the theory of the Ursprache, denounced by Mar and his school, and the quote mythical, unalterable units of inheritance of Mendel Morgan Weissman genetics. All at once, a quote free discussion on linguistic problems was opened in Pravda on the 9th of May 1950 with an article by Professor A.S. Chikobava titled On Certain Problems in Soviet Linguistics. On 20th June, Stalin himself intervened in the discussion, contributing a letter concerning Marxism in linguistics. This was followed by 4 further letters, the first dated the 29th of June, published in Pravda on the 4th of July, concerning certain problems of linguistics. Reply to Comrade E. Krashenikova. Then 3 letters headed by Reply to Comrades, published in Pravda on the 2nd of August, to Comrade Janjaev of the 11th of July, to Comrades D. Belkin and S. Fur of the 22nd of July, and to Comrade A. Kolopov. (28th of July, 1950). Stalin's first point against Mars that language is not to be assigned to the superstructure. It is not the product of a particular social structure, itself temporarily conditioned and relatively short-lived, but the outcome of society as a whole. Nor again can it be assigned to the superstructure, if for no other reason than because it stands in direct relation to production, whereas the superstructure is only indirectly dependent on production, i.e., by the way of the basis, the economic structure of society. But language cannot, on the other hand, be reckoned part of the basis either, and that means that there are structural phenomena belonging neither to the base nor the superstructure. It follows further from this that language is not conditioned by the class structure, as Mar had maintained it to be. It is the creation not of any single class, but of the whole of society. It is created as a whole for society in general, not in the interest of any one class at the expense of others, but in the same fashion for all. One should therefore be aware of confusing language with dialectic or jargon. Class-conditioned words peculiar to jargon constitute barely 1% of the total vocabulary. There is a special interest and significance in what Stalin has to say against Mar on the subject of linguistic development. The latter is governed by the developmental laws of society as a whole, the people, not those of the superstructure. This means that language develops not by way of sudden eruptions, explosions, but by way of a gradual accumulation of new elements and an equally gradual dying away of old ones. In general, the law of the transition from one quality to another by way of leaps continues to hold in the sphere of social development only for the society divided into mutually hostile classes, not for the socialist classless society. Here this law emerges in a new form. As for Mar's doctrine of, quote, language crossings, Stalin maintains for his part that when different languages encounter one another, they do not mingle to form a new one, but only prevails over the other. This is particularly observable in the history of the Russian language, which has always emerged victorious from encounters of this kind. Stalin finally goes on to accuse Marr of idealism on account of his doctrine of the unitary world language of the future, which will in fact no longer be a, quote, language at all, but rather a soundless and immediate communication of thoughts. Stalin regards this as implying a separation of language and thought. His view, on the contrary, is that thought is essentially bound up with language. There can be no thought without a material basis in language. The instance of deaf mutism only appears to constitute an argument against this, for even in their case, thoughts are associated with sense impressions, visual sensations, and impressions of touch, taste, and smell. To these factual objections, Stalin adds a last accusation that Marr and his, quote, disciples have set up a, quote, Arakcheyev regime, a, quote, Arakcheyev regime, end quote, within the field of linguistics, which has hitherto blocked all free expression of scientific opinion, and which now, thanks to the discussion opened in Pravda, has at last been exposed and demolished. For no science can prosper without conflict of opinion and freedom to criticize. These articles of Stalin's again produced a shattering effect, not only in the sphere of linguistics, where Marr, hitherto a star of the first magnitude, is now described as the, quote, Don Quixote of linguistics, end quote, and his quote, new theory, end quote, of language, like his, quote, school and his, quote, disciples, referred to only in quotation marks, but also in every department of theoretical inquiry. The articles have been discussed in innumerable sessions of learned bodies, and the new doctrines have been disseminated in books and articles by the score. The editors of Approci Philosophie expressed their regret at having published in recent numbers of the paper, numbers 1 and 3, 1949, fallacious articles propagating, quote, anti-Marxist doctrines of Marr and endorsing the Arakcheyev regime of his supporters. At the same time, they announced publication of further articles promulgating the, quote, Marxist theory of language and illuminating the problems raised by Stalin in these articles within the fields of dialectical and historical materialism. There's a footnote that I missed. Count Alexei Andreevich Arakcheyev lived from 1769 to 1834, the favorite of Alexander I. As Minister of War, he showed reckless brutality in implementing Alexander's universally unpopular scheme of, quote, military colonies, which enforced lifelong military service upon some 750,000 members of the population in the frontier provinces of Russia, and subjected their entire economic life, and to a large extent their private life as well, to a rigid system of discipline. In the last decade of Alexander's reign especially, Arakcheyev enjoyed the unlimited confidence of the monarch, so that in practice the whole conduct of the regime was in his hands. End footnote. Even before all 5 of Stalin's articles had yet appeared, the Philosophical Institute of the Academy of Sciences had already held 2 sessions on the 18th and 27th of July 1950, dedicated to consideration of Stalin's intervention in the linguistic field and its consequences in relation to the work of philosophy. A number of speakers, foremost among them Alexandrov, expatiated on the various philosophical problems raised by the latest of Stalin's works. In the field of historical materialism, Stalin has clarified the doctrine of the basis and the superstructure, and more especially has enlarged the theory of the active role of the superstructure and the conception of the nation. In the sphere of dialectical materialism, the law of the transition from quantity to quality, together with that of the unity of opposites, has been, quote, deepened in certain ways in certain very important respects. His arguments against Marr's language of the future have given Stalin the opportunity of dealing with problems of epistemology, particularly the question of the relation of thought and being. Great attention was also paid to Stalin's demand for freedom in science. Kedrov, in particular, the erstwhile chief editor of Vопроsi Philosophie, whose reprimand had given him a personal taste of the blessings of a, quote, Arakcheyev regime, quote, in the field of science, was insistent on the fact that Stalin's articles pointed to a campaign against vulgar Marxism not only in linguistics, but also in other fields such as those of logic and natural science. All speakers were in agreement that these articles of Stalin's represented a, quote, new world historical contribution to the treasury of Marxism, end quote. And this time they were not mistaken. Stalin's last personal intervention in the realm of Marxist theory far outweighs in importance the incursions of the party's Central Committee in previous years, and may yet perhaps establish itself in fact as of, quote, world historical significance, end quote. For whereas the previous attacks were chiefly directed against the formal aspects of Bolshevik doctrine, quote, partisanship, quote, pseudo-objectivism, quote, cosmopolitanism, etc., Stalin has on this occasion shaken the pillars of Marxist theory itself in his amplifications of historical materialism and the main position of dialectical materialism as such, as understood in the Soviet Union. The basic laws of the materialist dialectic concerning the transition from quantity into quality and the unity of opposites. Indeed, one almost has the impression that Stalin deliberately chose so harmless a field as that of linguistics for purposes of his attack, in order to correct certain fundamental points in Bolshevik doctrine. The seeming concern with linguistics in this connection was intended to lessen the impact which would otherwise have been produced by an open realignment of the basic tenets of Marxist-Leninist doctrine as hitherto understood. The real meaning of this démarche of Stalin's seems to have us to lie in the fact that the new course, which Stalin had been pursuing for at least 16 years in the field of Bolshevik politics, was now at last to find a theoretical anchorage also in, quote, Marxist-Leninist theory. We shall return to this subject again in the course of the following chapter. From this time on, Stalin's booklet on linguistics was to occupy a central position in all the subsequent activities of Soviet philosophers. On the first anniversary of the appearance of the letters, June 1951, a conference was held at the Philosophical Institute attended by more than 1,200 scholars. As was indicated in the speeches, it had been a year of strenuous toil. In the course of it, the academic co-workers of the Institute had published more than 50 articles in various journals and delivered over 350 lectures on the significance of what Stalin had said. It had also given birth to collective work published by the Institute, titled Problems of Dialectical and Historical Materialism in J.V. Stalin's Marxism and the Problems of Linguistics. The second anniversary of the appearance of this work of Stalin's was similarly observed at the Philosophical Institute by an augmented session of the Academic Council, as is also the case in other institutes. Meanwhile, 5 years had also elapsed since the philosophical, quote, discussion. Pravda took advantage of the occasion in its issue of the 12th of March 1952 to inform, quote, workers on the philosophical front, unquote, that although some improvements had been effected in the course of these years, the philosophers were still, quote, under heavy obligations to the Soviet public, end quote, and were only slowly fulfilling the party's directives. The editors of Vопроsi Philosophy just found it possible to refer to Pravda's criticism in the leading article of their second number, which was already in the press, applying itself critically to themselves and calling on Soviet philosophers to make this momentous 5th anniversary the occasion for, quote, an active display of creative criticism and self-criticism, end quote. The result of these heart-searchings are disclosed in the leading article of the following issue. In the course of the last 5 years, a certain advance has certainly been achieved. The themes treated of in philosophical writings have in general become more topical. Contact with the periphery has been restored. Efforts have been made towards training cadres and improving the quality of philosophical production, as can be seen from the fact that a number of works have been awarded the Stalin Prize. But in spite of this, philosophical productivity remains extremely poor in comparison with what is required. The textbook situation is still exceptionally bad. The 2-volume history of philosophy is only just being completed. The textbook on dialectical materialism is still bogged down in the preliminary stages. Among topics of discussion, the problems of dialectical materialism and of communist ethics and aesthetics are unduly neglected. The disproportion between the number of dissertations defended and the number published is still too great. And must be regarded as an indication of lowered quality. In September 1952, Stalin's last important work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, was published in the periodical Bolshevik. This was followed by the 19th Party Congress at the beginning of October, both of these events being also of crucial importance for the development of philosophy in the years that followed. The publication of Stalin's work on the eve of the 19th Congress was a clear indication that it was intended as Stalin's message to the Congress, at which on this occasion the general report was no longer to be delivered by himself as hitherto, but by his favorite pupil, Malenkov. In its external trappings, this work purports to consist of Stalin's concluding comments on an economic discussion convened in November 1951 to consider the plan of a textbook on political economy. The records of this discussion were submitted to Stalin, who now in the pamphlet delivers his final oracular judgment on a number of issues in dispute. The book consists of 4 independent sections. The first, Remarks on Economic Questions Connected with the February 1951 discussion, bears the date of the 1st of February 1952 and sets out Stalin's own position vis-a-vis the discussion. As in the case of Marxism and problems of linguistics, it is supplemented by various additional documents bearing on the subject, namely, quote, Reply to Comrade A.I. Notkin, 21st of April 1952, concerning the errors of Comrade L.D. Yaroshenko, 22nd of May 1952, and Reply to Comrades A.V. Sanina and V.G. Venger, 18th of September 1952. The most important part of it, philosophically speaking, is the first section of the Remarks on Economic Questions, which bears the subtitle Character of Economic Laws Under Socialism. Stalin here rebukes the impatience of certain youthful party members who have supposed that the Soviet regime, quote, can do anything, end quote, that it is bound by no objective economic laws and can, quote, create new laws of its own. They have repudiated the notion that economic laws have an objective character, independent of the will of man, and according to Stalin, they have fallen into a grave error. He stresses that under socialism, economic laws retain their objective necessary character, just as the laws of nature do. As with the laws of nature, so also with the former, man can do nothing else but recognize them, utilize them by guiding their operation into the particular channels willed by him, and, quote, impart a different direction to the destructive action of some of the laws, end quote. But to destroy them or create new economic laws is not within his power. In this work of Stalin's, the leader of the economic movement he condemns are not referred to by name, but from other Soviet publications we may gather that a certain N. Voznesensky is held to be chiefly responsible. In Voznesensky's book, The Soviet War Economy During the Great Patriotic War, which met with an exceptionally warm welcome on publication from the party press, Voznesensky has propounded the thesis that the socialist economy is determined by the state planning agencies, that the state is the, quote, source of motion and development in such an economy, and that the state's planning activities constitute its law of development. Fedoseev, Iovchuk, and Alexandrov also stand accused of the same heresy. For the rest, Stalin deals with other questions of less philosophical interest, the problems of commodity production and the law of value under socialism, the abolition of the antithesis between town and country and mental and physical labor, the disintegration of the single world market and the deepening crisis of the world capitalist system, the inevitability of wars between capitalist countries, the basic economic laws of modern capitalism and socialism, and, quote, other questions, end quote. In conclusion, he speaks of the international importance of the proposed textbook of political economy and points out ways of improving the draft textbook in question. Among all these problems, the most frequently discussed in Soviet philosophical literature are those of abolishing the antitheses between town and country and mental and physical labor, and of the basic laws of modern capitalism and socialism. As for the remaining documents in this booklet of Stalin's, the most important passage they contain is one in which he corrects Yaroshenko's views on the transition to communism and lays down the following 3 conditions for this transition. Firstly, the expansion of all social production, with a relatively higher rate of expansion of the production of means of production. Second, the raising of collective farm property by means of gradual transitions to the level of public property, and thirdly, quote, such a cultural advancement of society as will secure for all members of society the all-round development of their physical and mental abilities, end quote. Stalin, and this on two accounts. Quote, so that the members of society may be in a position to receive an education sufficient to enable them to be active agents of social development and in a position freely to choose their occupations and not be tied all their lives owing to the existing division of labor to some one occupation, end quote. Stalin. The 19th Party Congress of the CPSU Bolsheviks, which took place at the beginning of October 1952, was another important event in the further development of Soviet philosophy. Stalin's essay on the economic problems of socialism in the USSR, and more especially his remarks on the preconditions for the transition to communism, formed the ideological basis for its resolutions, and in particular for the congressional directives relating to the fifth five-year plan. The Congress also decided to set up a commission for the purpose of working out a new program for the Communist Party and called upon it to adopt Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR as the basis of its work. In his report to the 19th Party Congress, Malenkov made frequent and copious references to the problems of intellectual life. He outlined what the party had done to further the causes of popular education, science, culture, literature, and art, and was particularly critical in this connection of certain deficiencies in the fields of literature and art, complaining of the many colorless, empty, and tedious works still being produced. He again confronted Soviet artists and writers with the ideal of socialist realism, whose strength and meaning lie in the fact that it reveals the, quote, higher inner qualities and typical positive character traits of the ordinary man, end quote. But, quote, typical here must be understood to mean not merely, quote, that which is most frequently in evidence, end quote, but rather, quote, that which corresponds to the nature of the given social and historical phenomena, end quote. Instead of just, quote, the most widely distributed, most frequently recurring, most commonplace, the problem of the typical is in every case a political problem, end quote. Pravda, 6th of October, 1952. In the course of this, Malenkov attacks those who champion the theory of, quote, absence of conflict, end quote, who believe or at least behave as if they believed that there are no contradictions in Soviet reality, and calls for the cultivation of satire. Quote, it would be false to suppose that our Soviet reality offers no material for satire, Our Soviet art and literature must be bold in depicting the contradictions and conflicts of life, and in learning to employ the weapon of criticism as one of the most effective means of education, end quote. Malenkov. Towards the end of Malenkov's report, in speaking of the party, Malenkov deplores the fact that ideological work is too little regarded in many party circles, even at the highest level. Although Soviet society no longer provides any class basis for the dominance of bourgeois ideology, there are still extremely persistent residues of this, which do not die out of their own accord but must be fought against. The ideological training of cadres is particularly neglected. Quote, the deepening of political knowledge among party members and candidates is an essential condition for strengthening their leading role in all spheres of life, end quote. Nor has the Arakcheyev regime in many scientific institutions been altogether eliminated. Quote, in some branches of science, the monopoly of particular groups of intellectuals who repress the growth of fresh influences, insulate themselves from criticism, and attempt to solve scientific problems by administrative methods, has not yet been altogether liquidated. No branch of science can flourish effectively in a stifling atmosphere of mutual incense burning and concealment of errors, end quote. Malenkov had already insisted energetically in another connection on the need for continual recourse to criticism and self-criticism. These directions, emanating from the two highest sources of authority, Stalin and the Party Congress, laid a most pressing burden of obligation upon the Soviet ideologists to revise their work and to draw the necessary conclusions from what had been said. At its annual General Assembly from the 3rd of January to the 2nd of February 1953, the Academy of Sciences of the USSR applied itself to the task created for it by the resolutions of the 19th Party Congress, the President A.N. Nesmeyanov delivered an address on the, quote, tasks of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR in the light of the resolutions of the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, end quote. Nesmeyanov began by assigning to the philosophers the general duty of providing a, quote, theoretical generalization of the experience gained in the construction of socialism and of the prospects for the construction of communism in our country, end quote. A. N. Nesmeyanov. With reference to Stalin's latest work, A. N. Nesmeyanov then laid down the following programs of philosophical endeavor in the years to come. In the view of Stalin's observations on the objective character of economic laws, the philosophers must pay greater attention to the laws of social development and their employment in the interest of society, and to overcoming subjectivist conceptions of the laws of development in Soviet society. Fuller consideration must also be given to the relation between general sociological laws and the specific laws of development of individual groupings, and similarly to the relation between objective laws and the conscious activity of men. Still other problems thrown up in Stalin's essay must in the future be adopted by Soviet philosophers as topics of inquiry. The elimination of the essential distinction between town and country, and between mental and physical labor, and likewise the problem of the all-round development of personality under socialism and communism, and of the cultural advancement of society as one of the most essential preconditions for the transition to socialism. To communism. Probably with Malenkov's report in mind, the president of the Academy of Science also enjoined on the philosophers the working out of a Marxist aesthetics, a vigorous struggle against contemporary bourgeois ideology, and the laying bare of the connection between this ideology and the basic laws of present-day capitalism. The campaign against, quote, subjectivist interpretations of the laws of development, which Nesmeyanov calls for in the present context, was very energetically pursued by the party in the months which followed the publication of Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. This is particularly evident in connection with the Fedoseyev affair. P. Fedoseyev, a former chief editor of the Bolshevik, the theoretical organ of the party's Central Committee, had published 2 articles in the newspaper Izvestia on the 12th and 21st of December 1952, in which he commented on Stalin's new book and expressed orthodox disapproval of Voznesensky's position as failing to do adequate justice to the objective character of the laws of social development. In spite of this, he was violently attacked in Pravda 3 days later by M. Suslov, a member of the Presidium of the Central Committee, since Fedoseyev, when still chief editor of Bolshevik, caused articles to be printed in that paper wherein Voznesensky's, quote, un-Marxist views are lauded to the skies. He has exercised a damaging influence on the education of party functionaries. Administrative officials and scientific workers had committed a no less grievous offense in the eyes of the party. Hence it should now have been his duty to acknowledge this openly. Seeing that he has let slip this golden opportunity for self-criticism, one can only wonder if his present assertions coincide with his own inner convictions, or whether he is not in fact playing a double game. On the following day, Izvestia reprinted Suslov's article together with an editorial note declaring that it had been gravely in error in publishing Fedoseyev's unself-critical articles. Fedoseyev himself drew similar conclusions from Suslov's attack and made a clean breast of the matter in Pravda on the 2nd of January. Quote, having thought over the errors of the articles I published in Izvestia and become conscious of them, I acknowledge unreservedly the justice ... of the criticism passed on them by Comrade M. Suslov. I have to admit that in publishing my work ... I failed to display ... a self-critical attitude towards my own mistakes. At the time when I was chief editor of the paper Bolshevik, I permitted a number of authors to print articles in which Voznesensky's un-Marxist work, The Soviet war economy during the Great Patriotic War was praised to the skies. Having failed to recognize the anti-Marxist core of the subjectivist position, I allowed the journal Bolshevik to be used for the dissemination of these extremely pernicious ideas, and thereby did harm to the party's ideological work. When in my articles I explained Stalin's thesis as to the objective character of the laws governing society, I should have made it my duty, to be openly critical of my own false, uncritical, and fundamentally complacent attitude. In neglecting to do this, I failed to do my elementary duty and did not apply the party's demand for self-criticism to my own case. My articles on the laws of social development are therefore inadequate and can justly be regarded as an attempt to gloss over my own failings. I shall draw the necessary lessons from the criticism in Pravda and will do everything to remedy and overcome my faults." This article of Suslov's also caused alarm among the editors of Vопроsi Philosophy. They hunted through all the back numbers of the periodical, right back to the year of its foundation in 1947, and fortunately discovered two articles, one written in 1949 and the other in 1947, in which theories were propounded that were no longer tenable after the appearance of Stalin's latest work. In the leading article of the final 1952 number, which luckily had not yet gone to press, they therefore hastened to add yet another self-critical admission of guilt. Quote, "As M.A. Suslov has shown, it is, quote, the elementary duty of every party member not to gloss over past mistakes, not to sidle around them, but rather to confess them openly and honorably, and to remedy them." End quote. This observation also has an immediate implication to Vопроsi Philosophy, which has given space to a number of articles containing erroneous assertions about the laws of development of socialist society. End quote. And that's from the 19th Congress of the Communist Party and Problems of Ideological Work. VF 1952, number 6, page 12. This number was printed on the 18th of January, 1953. And that is the end of Chapter 9 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Thank you so much for listening.